because it is an intention of providence that peoples do not melt together, but are in conflict with one another through repelling forces, the national pride and national hatred is necessary for the separation of nations. Therefore, either through religion, where people believes that all others are cursed, as Jews or Turks, or through the sense of superiority of the intellect that all others were unskilled and ignorant, or of bravery that everyone had to be afraid of the people, or of freedom that all others were slaves, a people loves its country before others. Governments like to see this delusion. This is the mechanism and the make-up of the world, which through instinct connects and separates us. Reason, on the other hand, gives us the law that, since instincts are blind, they may direct the animality in us, but must be replaced by maxims of reason. For that reason, this national delusion is to be eradicated, in whose stead there must come patriotism and cosmopolitanism. Immanuel Kant. So far, I've spent this year talking about the first stage of what Kant calls the public right, which would be the state's right. Because all right to Kant is about what he calls the mine and yours. It is about property. There is the innate rights, so that is that which is mine by birth, like my body and everything belonging to that. So I have rights not to be harmed, not to be killed, like the basic human rights. And then there's acquired rights. So the rights to that which has not been mine by birth, but which becomes mine at some point, like the right to my house or whatever. And to Kant, there is a private right, which describes the right in the state of nature. So in a condition without state, without laws, without institutions enforcing those laws. Here too, there is a mine and yours, and we should follow reason and respect what belongs to others, what is not ours. But of course, the issue here is, for one, we cannot be certain that everyone will do this, that everyone will act rationally and respect our property. Because that would require everyone being good in the ethical sense. And second, even if everyone had good intentions, still conflicts could arise. Maybe not so much about that which is mine by birth, but about that which I acquire, which becomes mine. Because here there can be conflicts about who acquired it first, or which way of acquiring is correct, right? I have used on several occasions the example of someone having a garden with a fence around and an apple tree in the garden, but a branch reaches over the fence and the apple falls down into the neighbor's garden. Now, does it belong to the neighbor because it's in his garden, or does it belong to me because it's from my tree? Both might not want to steal from one another, but both might genuinely think that they are justified in taking this apple for themselves. So, for that reason, the state of nature is a state of perpetual injustice, of perpetual, at least potential war, because war is the only way to resolve these conflicts about property and the state of nature. And for that reason, we should leave the merely private right, where, according to Kant, the principle is just neminem ledere, so harm nobody, And we should enter a state of public right, where the principle would be suum quicque tribur, give to each his own, that is, guarantee to each person that this is his and will not be touched by others, and if they do touch it, if they do harm him in his property, then there will be consequences. So the public right is based on a social contract, and the public right establishes general laws for everyone and establishes institutions that enforce those laws. And this public right, again, according to Kant, has three levels. The state's right, so the rights, the laws within one state, establishing peace, establishing justice between the individuals of that specific state. Secondly, the right of nations, so international law, which is supposed to establish justice and peace between nations, between states. And lastly, the cosmopolitan right, which you could say, in a sense, is to establish peace on Earth as a whole, which you could say, in a sense, is the basic human right, or the condition for there to be human rights. And as I said, for several weeks I've talked about states' rights. So what is the state for? What is its task? How should the state deal with crimes? How should it punish? How should the state be run? What's the difference between ruling and governing? And how should the state be governed? And how can we get to that point? How can we improve the state? How can we turn despotism into republicanism? All those things I discussed. And in my upcoming lectures, I want to discuss the two higher levels of the public right. I want to discuss first the right of nations, and then also the cosmopolitan right. And for a transition, I think it is fitting to talk about, you could say, the mindsets, the attitudes, the postures that we should have, both towards the state and beyond. Meaning, I want to talk first about patriotism, and then second about cosmopolitanism, which to Kant actually don't contradict one another, but rather they belong with one another. Patriotism obviously being about one state, and therefore this closes off what I said about states right, while cosmopolitanism obviously goes beyond the state, and thereby will introduce the right of nations and the cosmopolitan right. So patriotism to Kant is an, let's say, attitude that we should take towards our state. We should be patriots. But it is important how he understands this, because it has very little to do with what people may think of nowadays when they hear the word patriotism, and it has much more to do with the original meaning that it had for the Romans. I already mentioned the word in my lecture on despotism and republicanism, the two forms of government. And there I said that according to Kant, there are basically three main characteristics of the republic that distinguish it from the despotism. First, in a republic, people as human beings are free, which means that they are subjected only to laws that they could have given to themselves. They are subjected to rational laws that restrict freedom only as much as is necessary to protect it. And they are subjected to laws that make sense, and they can understand that those laws make sense, and therefore, if they are rational, voluntarily follow those laws. While despotic laws restrict freedom more than necessary, and we would only follow them because we are forced to, because the state is much more powerful than we are, but not because we understand them to be good laws that should be followed. The second condition was that as subjects of the state, all people are equal, are equally dependent on the state, which means that everyone is equal before the law, which means that everyone can rise to the highest or fall to the lowest position within the state. We are not determined by birth, but by our actions, by our deeds. And everyone can force everyone else, but only through the state, only through the laws, never directly. So there are no masters, no lords within the state except the state itself. There can be no noble class, no slaveholder class, whatever. And the third condition was that those who are independent, that is, those that don't depend on somebody else, those that can live from their own property, be it their land, be it their wealth and money, or be it a less material property. Maybe they know a craft, an art, a science, and can live off of that. But those that are independent like that, they should be active citizens, and they should be independent as citizens. And as citizens, they should take part in the law giving. Maybe not directly, maybe through representatives, but the laws should be given not as representing a particular will of just a despot, not even of just a majority, but rather they should represent the united general will of the people that are fraternally united. So those were the three characteristics of the Republic. With the motto of the French Revolution, you can say liberty, equality, and fraternity. And the first condition, freedom or liberty, here I said in that lecture on the Republic that the ruler, whoever he may be, a single monarch, a senate of aristocrats, or the people in democracy, the ruler is a despot if he does not let the people be free, if he makes laws that take their freedom away. And I said there that this is true even if they are benevolent laws that are supposed to make people happy. I mean, you may think as a ruler that people should not take drugs because it's bad for them, and therefore may prohibit all sorts of drugs, the drugs that are prohibited now, but also maybe smoking or alcohol or whatever. Or you may think as a ruler, according to your faith, that people that engage in acts of homosexuality will go to hell, and to prevent that, you may forbid them from doing so. Or you may force people to eat healthy food or whatever. It doesn't matter, you are still taking their freedom away. The point to Kant is that despotism is not necessarily tyranny. Tyranny that actually plagues and tortures the people is a form of despotism, of course, but there can also be a benevolent despotism. But if you take people's freedom away, this is still against what is just. The laws are not just, are not rational then. And this is still despotic. And people, at least those people that have a sense for their own dignity, for their own self-worth, at least those people that want to live as human beings and not just as animals, like a cow that is just happily eating grass and not caring that she's fenced in. At least those people cannot be happy under such a rule, no matter how benevolent it is, because for their happiness being free, including having the freedom to make themselves happy, not being forced to be happy according to someone else's concepts of happiness, is an integral part of their happiness. So such a government, I said, would be a paternalistic government, with the ruler acting as a father, treating the people not as citizens, not as adults, but as dependent, immature children. And here I said, Kant contrasts the paternalistic, the fatherly, and necessarily despotic government with a patriotic government, a fatherlandish, not a fatherly government, as he says. This is in accordance with republicanism. If the ruler acts not as a father to dependent children, but acts as a first amongst equals, and acts with a patriotic attitude. But of course, unfortunately, the word patriotism is a word that, since the days of Kant, has been misused and abused a lot, and therefore has shifted its meaning or will lead to very wrong associations. So it is important to stress that Kant is not talking about anything that today would be called patriotism. That is, he is not talking about nationalism, not even about some sort of weaker, more harmless form of nationalism or whatever. Like when people say, oh, nationalists hate other countries, patriots just love their own country. I mean, loving your own country is still completely irrational. Why would you love a country just because you happen to be born in it? It has nothing to do, when Kant talks about patriotism, it has nothing to do with being proud of your country. In fact, I can stress here that being proud of is always unaufklärt. To be sure, amongst those, there's nothing more unaufklärt than being proud of your country, being proud of your nation. I mean, that's just pathetic. That is just for people that have nothing else. I mean, this does not involve any accomplishment of your own. It's not like you chose to be born specifically into that nation. So you are just basically claiming other people's accomplishments for your own, probably because you have none of your own. This is completely pathetic, and no even somewhat rational person has ever felt proud of his country. But even being proud of other things, for example, even as a kid, I watched many movies, particularly American movies. I found were often obsessed with parents, especially the father, being proud of their children. Like there were so many movies about a child wanting to hear from the father that he is proud of him. Why? Why would you be proud of your child? Whatever your child accomplishes is not your own accomplishment. So how can you be proud of that? And even as a kid, I found it weird how obsessed in these, again, especially American movies, they were with this. Like, my dad never told me that he was proud of me, but I never felt that I was lacking anything from him because of that. But even if you are proud of your own accomplishments, if you are proud of, I don't know, looking good, earning lots of money, having good grades in school, at the end of the day, that still means that you depend your value on something which is not you. At the end of the day, this still implies that if you did not have these good looks, this money, these good grades, you would have less value. So being proud of something is always an unaufklärt feeling. The aufklärt person is simply proud without a preposition. Proud as in, I won't do this thing, this goes against my pride, this is too undignified for me. So sure, as a human being, as a rational being, you should have your pride, but it should not be pride of something, it should not depend on something. So no, this is not what Kant means when he is talking of patriotism. Rather, what he understands by patriotism is where everyone in the state, not accepting its head, regards the commonwealth as a maternal womb, or the land as the paternal ground from which he himself sprang, and which he must leave to his descendants as a treasured pledge. Each regards himself as authorized to protect the rights of the commonwealth by laws of the general will, but not to submit it to his personal use at his own absolute pleasure. Now it's important to really think through what Kant is saying here, because many might miss the very far-reaching implications this has. I already said that nowadays, in our superficial time, we tend to have very simple concepts of politics, and we tend to just distinguish between democracy and dictatorship. And this to us is mostly about the question who rules. Dictatorship is if one or maybe one party rules, and if the people are in charge, that's a democracy and that is good. The whole point for Kant is that he distinguishes, when he talks about despotism and republicanism, or now in this case more specifically about paternalism and patriotism, that what he cares about is the posture, or you could say the attitude of those who are in charge, so of the sovereign, of the overlord. The main point is not, is there one in charge or are all in charge, but rather, what do they do with being in charge? How do they understand their own role, and how do they treat the state? So here the point is that the government is a patriotic government if it truly serves the state. So if it understands itself to be the custodian of the state that was entrusted with the whole, and that is tasked with taking care of the state as a whole, and eventually, when the sovereignty passes on, to also pass on the whole. Now, the sovereignty may pass on in different ways. In a monarchy, the king dies, and then maybe the prince will take over as the next king. But also in a democracy, of course, the sovereignty passes on with the generations, right? The old people die, but the people is replaced by the children that come after them. And the point is that the state and whatever is needed for the state, for the laws, for the justice, for the peace of the state to remain, must be kept intact, must be preserved, and must be passed on as a whole by the sovereign. You can go back to my lecture on the basic task of the state and why there can be no private ownership of basic resources. there I already said that according to Kant, the elements, the air, the earth, the water, and the fire, meaning whatever produces energy, cannot just be used up and therefore cannot be in private hands, because they belong to the substance of the state. And if they are used up, the state as such would break down or would lose its monopoly on power. So this is part of a patriotic government, being sustainable, holding on to the basic resources, not wasting them, not using them all up, not selling them into private hands, and so on. And so you could say that, on the other hand, the government is unpatriotic if the overlord does not act as the custodian entrusted with the state, but rather treats the state and what belongs to the state, what belongs to the substance of the state, like the resources, treats the state as his own private property that he can use and use up and abuse however he likes, without having to think about the future, without having to think about whether there will be anything left that is functioning and that can be passed on. So the government is unpatriotic if the state is treated as loot for the sovereigns, the overlords' own private self-interest. And this, therefore, would of course be true if you have a despotic monarchy, if you have a tyrant, or if you have a despotic aristocracy, that is, if you have oligarchs. In both cases, the tyrant or the oligarchs, they are unpatriotic because, again, they treat the state as loot, as their private property. They don't act as servants of the whole. But the important point would be here that a democracy is not necessarily patriotic and republican. A democracy can also be unpatriotic. And indeed, if you consider this, then you would have to judge that our modern Western democracies, and not just the Western ones, are also despotic states and not proper republics. That we make them despotic because the people, and this very much includes those people on the right who like to talk about their patriotism, because the people utterly lack patriotism. Because the people, and in democracy, of course, the people are the sovereign, are the overlord. The people treat the state as their own private property and loot, not as something they were entrusted with for safekeeping. So you could say that our democracies are still despotic. The difference is just to a tyranny or an oligarchy that you don't have just one or a few despots, but rather everyone can be despot in his small way. Everyone can take part in the despotism, and everyone tries or hopes for, if he happens to be part of a majority, being able to grab the biggest piece of the cake for himself or for his own group. But all want a piece of the cake, and all don't care if the whole cake gets eaten up to the last crumb and there's nothing left for those who may come after. And I could give many, many, many examples to illustrate this and to prove that. I will instead just give one, but I will give the one example that should prove this without any doubt or without any possibility of anyone disagreeing. And that is the example, of course, of the climate crisis. If people were patriots, they would take the climate emergency seriously, and they would make sure to live in such a manner that is sustainable, that lets the climate stay intact, so that they can pass on the state they were entrusted with to the next generation, and the state can still function. The laws, the justice, the peace can still be retained, instead of everything breaking down because all the resources were used up, or because there are natural catastrophes, or because there are droughts and there's not enough water or food, or because it's too hot, or whatever. So if people were patriots, and didn't treat the state as their private loot, their only concern would not be the price of their fuel, or whether there's a speed limit, or whether they can drive around in these large SUVs that are basically tanks, instead of walking or biking or taking public transport around the city, maybe, or whether they can fly on vacation, because it's more convenient than taking the train. But rather, if they were true patriots, and here you see that especially those who call themselves patriots are not, because the right wingers are the ones who openly deny the climate crisis usually. If they were true patriots, then they would take a step back, and then they would be willing to serve the state, to serve the laws, to serve the justice, to serve the peace, and to make sacrifices for that. Instead, on the other hand, which is unpatriotic and despotic, of the sovereign who does so, instead of, on the other hand, sacrificing the state for themselves, wanting the state to serve them instead of wanting to serve the state. So you could say that the true patriotism is in this famous speech of Kennedy, where he says, don't ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. That many people, and once again, including those self-proclaimed patriots on the right, don't ask what can I do for my country. Rather, they expect their country to serve them. They don't want to sacrifice themselves in any, even the smallest manner, for their own country. Here I want to remind you once more that I would say it follows from Kant's architectonic method that there must be three forms of government: the republican government, the autocratic government, but also the fascistic government. And I would say that fascism is a crude and perverse mix between the other two, that is, between the republic and the autocracy. Because true republican patriotism is when the lawgiver, the sovereign, and in a democratic republic that means the people at large, is willing to serve the state instead of making the state serve him, is willing to sacrifice himself for the state. Well, this is something that also fascism demands from people, right? In fascism, the individual is not there for himself, and the state is not there for the individual, but rather the individual is expected to serve the whole and to sacrifice himself for the whole. But the difference is, what is this whole that the individual is expected to serve? In a true republic, this whole is rational. The laws are laws that guarantee and that secure freedom, and that were given by reason itself. So the individual is expected to serve reason in the end. While in fascism, and this is what it has in common not with the republic but with autocracy, that which the individual has to serve is arbitrary, is just um, the irrational oppressive will of a human being or of a number of human beings, but not of reason. So you could say that fascism combines the form of the patriotic republic, that is, the individual not treating the whole as his loot, as a cake to carve out pieces for himself, but rather the individual serving and sacrificing himself for the whole, and combines it with the material, with the content of autocracy. That is, the state not being run by reason, but by an arbitrary will of a human individual. And once you recognize this, once you recognize that fascism combines the form of the patriotic republic with the material of autocracy, you can also better understand the attitude of the liberal ausklärt people. Now, Ausklärung is the half-assed pseudo-Aufklärung. So if Aufklärung is translated as enlightenment, so I have my reasons which I gave in another lecture for disliking that translation, you could maybe translate Ausklärung as entwilightment. And these ausklärt people, they think of themselves as being the aufklärt people, and they tend to attack and criticize the actual Aufklärung as being fascist, or as, that is one of their favorite words, being totalitarian. So they tend to confuse actual Aufklärung with fascism. I have heard Kant being accused of having totalitarian tendencies, but I have also heard Rousseau or Fichte being accused of totalitarianism. I myself have been accused of totalitarianism before in my life, and surely it won't have been the last time. Surely it will continue. Why is this? We should use Kant's sympathetic method here. That too I have discussed in an earlier lecture that you can check out. Kant says there is no total error, there's only partial error. So even a wrong opinion must contain a grain of truth that make it seem true to those who hold it. Otherwise, if it was simply completely wrong, then no one could believe in it. So when the ausklärt people accuse Aufklärung of being fascistic or totalitarian, what is the grain of truth here? Well, it's exactly what I said before, that the form of the patriotic republic, this serving and self-sacrificing, is the same as the form of fascism. I've often heard ausklärt people cry about this claim to absolutism, saying this reason that Rousseau or Kant or Fichte are talking about, this truth they are talking about, that it's absolute, saying that the belief in good and evil, in white and black, that I share, that someone like Greta Thunberg shares, that this is totalitarian. Because it does not fit with their own relativism. Now, of course, that is a deeply dishonest form of criticism, because it is just so obviously self-contradicting. I mean, what they are essentially saying is the belief in good and evil, in black and white, is evil, is black. But how can it be if, according to them, everything is relative and there is nothing evil, there is nothing black? They say believing in something absolutely good and absolutely bad is absolutely bad. They say you people what you are doing, what you are saying, that leads to totalitarianism. Well, maybe it does. Let's assume for a second it does. But if we are not to believe in something totally good or totally evil, then totalitarianism is not evil. What's bad about totalitarianism if there is no good and bad? So their criticism is obviously dishonest, but we can at least understand where it comes from. Again, because they look only at the form. Of course, the problem is that they abstract from the material. So all they hear when the fascist and when the aufklärt Republican are talking is that both are saying your private whims, your private, selfish, egoistical, arbitrary choices are not the highest thing there is. And you cannot subject the whole state to them, but rather you have to submit to something higher. That is indeed what both the aufklärt Republican and the fascist will say. And that is all the ausklärt person will hear. What he will not differentiate is that this higher thing that both want him to submit to is very different. In one case, it's universal reason. And in the other case, it's again a very particular, private, arbitrary choice. And it makes sense that they don't see that difference because aufklärt people are irrationalists, meaning they don't believe in reason. To them, reason is not a thing. So to them, what the aufklärt person says is just an empty claim. They believe the aufklärt Republicans just claim to serve reason, but that what they are talking about is just as arbitrary, is just as particular as what the fascist is talking about. And here we see that the ausklärd people lack what all unaufklärt people lack, and that is self-criticism, self-reflection. Because they will cry about their freedom being taken away. As good liberal relativists, they will say, oh, both the aufklärt Republican and the fascists, they are so absolute. They demand total submission. They will end your freedom. But if they had some self-reflection, they would realize that this freedom of theirs, that they cling to so much, is just their freedom to their arbitrariness, to their whims. It's just their freedom to their selfishness. It's just their freedom to be despotic. So it's just their freedom to exploit and to oppress others and to take others' freedom away. And that alone is the freedom that the aufklärt Republican wants to take away. Of course, the fascist wants to take something else away, but the aufklärt Republican only wants this freedom to make others unfree, to go away, and nothing else. And here I would remind these ausklärt people that it is, well, it is not just dishonest, it is downright infuriating to say that both the person that wants total justice, total goodness, total peace, as well as the person that wants total injustice, total evilness, total war, are both the same simply because the form is the same, simply because they both want something total and not something relative. And I would also remind these ausklärt people that if we have a constitution, and for example here in Germany we have a constitution with some basic rights like the right to live, the right to freedom, the right to free speech, and the constitution says these rights cannot be taken away even by a majority. they are set in stone. This is not democratic. This is we are used to call this democratic, and I got taught in school that this is true democracy, but sorry, it just isn't. This is an undemocratic element. This says the people, the demos, they are told that here is something that they, even if they wanted to, cannot change. It is undemocratic, but it is republican. It is patriotic, because it makes sure that the state and the freedom, the peace of the state, the justice don't just exist for now and can be taken away, but that they will be passed on. And so I would tell these ausklärung people, if you really want to be consistent, which of course they never are, you would have to reject such a constitution and such unchangeable basic rights, because they go against your relativism. They are, in your language, they are totalitarian, they are absolute. And if that is what totalitarianism means to you, which I think is an abuse of the word, but okay, so be it, then I will gladly take the name of totalitarian. Then I will feel honored being called totalitarian, because yes, I am for total human rights. I am for the total right to live. I am for total right to freedom. But back to Kant and to his concept of patriotism. We can see here that liberal democracy, as we have it nowadays, simply means despotic democracy. Because once again, it means everyone taking part in the despotism, everyone taking part in the looting of the state. Nowadays, most, from the left to the right, are liberals, are self-serving, are egoistical, want the freedom, not the rational freedom, but rather the irrational freedom to do what they want, even if it harms others, even if it harms the whole. They want to simply be left alone by the state. Of course, it is especially ironic and infuriating that, of all people, these right-wingers, these right-wing liberals and libertarians call themselves patriots. They very clearly are not. They very clearly are the opposite of patriots. They don't care what happens to the whole. They don't care what world they leave to their children. I mean, once again, just think about the issue of the environment, the climate, the sustainability. If they leave to the next generation droughts or soil that is so poisoned, so polluted that nothing can grow in it, or a world where the insects have died out and because of that nothing can grow, that's not their problem. But it's not just environmental issues. I mean, whatever the current issue, whatever the current challenge of the day is, the common thread that runs through the politics of these right-wingers is always, leave us alone. We won't take responsibility. So if there's a pandemic, they will say, I don't care about the pandemic. I don't want to get vaxxed. I don't want to social distance. I can't even be bothered to wear a mask while shopping at a store or while being on the subway. So I don't want to be a patriot. I don't want to serve the whole and make even the smallest sacrifice. And when the West is attacked, when we are at war with Moscow, when there's an invasion in Ukraine, again, they say, what is it to me? I don't want to take part in that. I don't want to defend my freedom, my way of life. When there are refugees coming here, they are not helping with that. All they are doing is going online and bitching on the internet. I mean, in 2015, when such a large number of refugees started coming to Germany, I was being a patriot. I volunteered. I went 3, 4 times a week, about 10 hours a week or so, to a refugee camp, giving German lessons there for free. That is a patriotic act. I was not the only person doing that. There were others doing the same. But funnily enough, none of these people were far right. I didn't see a single one of these right wingers. The only place where I saw them was online, where they were complaining about the refugees. But they were not doing anything helping their state, helping their society, helping their people with this challenge, helping integrate these refugees. No, they left us alone with these tasks, like these selfish fuckers they always are. And you can also see whom they like, whom they dislike. For example, some years ago here in Germany, um, more or less about the same time, there were two types of protest. There was the group Last Generation, climate activists that would glue themselves onto the street, blocking traffic in order to protest for the climate. Now, obviously, this is a patriotic protest. Now, you could discuss about the form of it, if it really worked so well, if it was strategically, pragmatically the best way of protest they could have come up with. By all means, we can discuss that. But that's not the point here. The point is their will that drove them, what they wanted to achieve. Clearly, they were being patriotic. They were not serving their own private selfish interest, but rather they were serving the interest of the whole, of the state, of the future. They wanted the state to remain, to stay intact. In fact, they were sacrificing for that. I mean, no one forced them to glue themselves to the street. In fact, they would have benefited if it was just about their private interest from not doing that. All they received was hate, people screaming at them, attacking them, even wanting to run them over with their cars, them being fined, being imprisoned. Some activist who did that was barred from becoming a teacher because, God forbid, having teachers with some patriotism and some civil courage who actually care about the children's future. This was clearly patriotic. And online, there was so much hate, so much abuse hurled at those people, together with these dishonest claims that, oh, these activists gluing themselves to the street, they are blocking ambulances and thereby threatening people's lives, even though the activists always left a line for the ambulance. And then, about the same time, just a little bit afterward, you had big farmers' protests here. Farmers driving with their tractors to Berlin, blocking the streets, blocking ambulances. And there actually was a case where they did threaten people's lives, where people almost died because they had blocked the street. And these farmers were only protesting for themselves. They were protesting against some new law that would have made them paid more. And I mean, there could have been a patriotic farmers' protest. They could have said to the government, we, the farmers, we want to farm in a sustainable manner. We want our farming to not destroy nature so that farming in the future becomes impossible, but rather we want to be able to farm sustainably, and we want the state to help us in that, to make it possible to farm sustainably without going bankrupt. And that is what we are protesting for. If they had said that, that would have been a patriotic protest. But no, it was a selfish protest. They just didn't want to pay more. And they wanted to actually continue to be able to, with their way of farming, harm the environment. So this was an unpatriotic protest. This was a protest not for the polity as a whole, but against the polity. A protest to be able to harm other people. And yet, because so many people resent the government, of course, the people were on the side of those farmers. The people applauded those farmers because they also were against the government. And this is something you can see wherever you look. Always true patriots, someone like Greta Thunberg, are hated, especially by those people who claim to be patriots, while unpatriotic people are cheered on. And I mean, you can see how unpatriotic these right-wingers are if you just observe how they treat each other. I mean, there's no solidarity even between them. I mean, so many of these people leading right-wing movements or protests or being well-known right-wing influencers or whatever are just grifters that will happily let all those fools that are dumb enough to follow them pay for them, and will most certainly not sacrifice themselves for the cause. Or just think of their politicians, of their leaders. I mean, say about the actual fascists whatever you want, but at least they were in a way serving their ideology and not just themselves. I mean, there is a clear distinction between someone like Hitler and someone like Trump. If you look at the right-wing leaders nowadays, and it really doesn't matter where you look, take Trump in the US or Bolsonaro in Brazil or Orban in Hungary or Le Pen and the Front National in France, or take the AfD here in Germany, take Erdogan in Turkey, take Netanyahu in Israel. I mean, what is the thing they all have in common? I mean, apart from with their politics, with their speeches and so on, attacking human dignity and doing racist politics, what's the one thing they have in common? It's that they are terribly corrupt. All of them, without exception. I mean, there's not a single one where you could say, okay, maybe I don't agree with his opinions, but at least he has some integrity. At least he stands for what he believes. No, it's very clear that they are in it for themselves. I mean, look at Trump getting richer and richer with his meme coin, or getting presents, getting a plane as present. It's very clear that he is in it for himself and his own family. Or look at someone like Netanyahu. I mean, even if you are a racist, an anti-Semite, because let me remind you, Arabs are Semites, who doesn't give a fuck about the Palestinians and who is okay with a genocide, even from that perspective, if you only cared about the Israelis, you should have been against Netanyahu. I mean, he was sacrificing the hostages. It is very clear from the two big hostage deals, the one early on, the one at the end, that the best way to free the hostages was negotiations and was an exchange of hostages, giving out some of the many, many hostages that Israel holds. It's very clear that through military means, almost no hostages were rescued in 2 years. In fact, more hostages were killed through military means than were rescued. And I mean, it's an open secret that one big reason for Netanyahu to not negotiate, to not exchange hostages, but to keep the war going, was just wanting to stay in power because there are corruption charges against him. And because the moment he stops being prime minister, he might go to jail. So you have there someone who is willing to sacrifice hostages, to sacrifice his own countrymen, and to keep a war going, which of course also very much hurts the economy, which very much hurts the reputation of the country, turning it more and more into an international pariah, which of course also hurts the soldiers, and not just those that get killed, but also those that come back traumatized, just so that he personally won't go to jail for corruption. Can there be a more unpatriotic leader than that? And yet still these right-wingers will support such people, which proves that they themselves are not patriots. And they are the opposite. And that is precisely why they go for such leaders. That is precisely why they love corrupt grifters. Such people are right-wing liberals. Now, I've said it before, and I will say it again. Today's political concepts that we work with are often very superficial, very simple, very crude. And this does not just go for the common person's concepts, but also for the scholars' concepts, for the concepts of the politologists. So I often hear the rise of the right, be it Trump in America, be it the AfD here in Germany, be it elsewhere, I often hear it described as a new rise of fascism. And from the way many people are talking, and again, not just common people, not just leftist activists or whatever, but also scholars, you could get the impression that fascism is simply another word for authoritarianism or for far right. Well, I disagree with that. I would say that the common phenomenon is not simply fascism, and it is an error, and a dangerous error, to misjudge it like that. No. I would ask people who call this fascism, where do these right-wingers talk about Gleichschaltung, that is coordination or synchronization? Where do they demand the subjection of the individual, of the particular, under the whole? If anything, what they want is the opposite. And what they do, what someone like Trump does, is the opposite. Subjecting the whole under the particular, under one selfish individual. And the promise that these right-wingers are giving to their voters, to their followers, is not, if you support us, then you will all be coordinated, you will all march in lockstep behind your leader, but rather what they promise is the opposite. What they promise is, if you support us, then you can follow your own arbitrary whims. You don't have to submit to save the environment, or to save people during a pandemic, or to save your country from an attack, from a war. You can do whatever you want. The reason such leaders like Trump are supported is not in spite of him having no integrity, in spite of him having no decorum and no manners, in spite of him constantly lying and being corrupt and selfish and being crude. No, the promise is, if you support me, you can be like me, maybe on a smaller scale because you're not rich and you're not a president, but you can be just as much a liar without integrity. You can be just as selfish, just as crude. You can abuse other people just as much. That is the promise. And that is not fascism. And once you realize that, you can come to the understanding that fascism is not so much about a specific ideology, it is a posture. Yes, there is certainly a right-wing fascism, with the Nazis, for example, but there's also a left-wing fascism, with the Stalinists, with the Bolsheviks. There's also a fundamentalist fascism amongst evangelicals, or amongst Kahanists, or amongst, say, the Taliban. And just like there's a right and a left fascism, you can realize that the Ausklärung, with its relativism, its arbitrariness, its liberal selfishness, there can be a left Ausklärung, but there can also be a right-wing Ausklärung. And that is what we are seeing here. And of course, the ausklärt people, the liberal, ausklärt, maybe slightly left-leaning humanists, cannot allow themselves to see that. First of all, that would imply self-criticism, which is the path towards Aufklärung, so it's something they don't do. But they cannot allow themselves to see that, because if they were to see that, then they would have to realize that they have more in common at the core principle, at the roots, that they have more in common with these right-wingers that they so dislike, than they would like to admit to themselves, maybe. And it would also mean that, on the other hand, they can no longer attack the actual Aufklärung as being totalitarian, leading to fascism or whatever. So they will not allow themselves to see that. Now, all of this is not to say that this right-wing Ausklärung is completely separate from right-wing fascism. I'm not saying just because it is not fascism right now, there are no fascist elements, or it cannot turn into fascism. Quite the opposite. Ausklärung does lead to fascism, and there's probably not a single ausklärt person which, if you just annoy him a little bit, and it's often quite surprising how little is needed, does not rip off his mask and turn into a fascist. I'm very much aware of that. And so are the actual fascists. They know who are their friends, or at least their fellow travelers, and who are their real enemies, the actual aufklärt people. But the ausklärt people, they of course will not see that. They of course will not admit that to themselves. But anyways, all of this, this completely unpatriotic, completely selfish attitude of the right-wingers, this looting of the state, this is precisely what allows to call them the mob or the rebel. And this is what Kant calls the unpatriotic people. And it's not simply polemics. He defines a mob or a rebel as a mass of people, right? Just one single person cannot be a mob. So that is what they have in common with the people. Capital P, the people. But the difference is, the mob is a mass of people that refuses to truly be united by law, by justice, that actually fights and resists being united like that. So you could say, if you think of Kant's two concepts of freedom that I explained in my lecture on freedom, the wild or savage freedom that is completely unrestricted and thereby destroying itself, and then on the other hand, freedom restricted by laws that actually protect the freedom, then you could say the mob or the rebel are those people who are savages at heart, are the barbaric people, because barbarians to Kant are those who resists being put under the law. They are those people who fight for keeping their wild, their unrestricted freedom, and who fight against the state putting their freedom under law. And that is precisely why they cannot be patriots, why they don't want to serve the state and that law and make sure that this law that actually protects freedom, that actually makes sure the freedom is not, so to say, eating itself, stays in place. They don't do that because being the mob, being the rebel, this true freedom under the law is precisely what they are rejecting and what they are fighting against. The mob is a number of people, of individuals coming together, wanting to stay particular individuals, resisting unifying into a true community where the particular is more than a particular individual, where the particular would be part of a whole. With this, I want to turn to the second characteristic of the Republic. So the first is that every human being, as a human being, has to be free. That is, has to be subjected only to laws that he could have given himself, not to arbitrary oppressive rule, even benevolent rule, that paternalistically and patronizingly wants to actually make him happy. No? In a true republic, you have laws that serve more of a negative function to keep freedom in place. And a truly republican government is a patriotic government, in the sense of patriotism meaning serving the whole, being the custodian of the whole, and being the custodian of these just laws that secure freedom and peace. So to come back to Kant, in conclusion, the posture of a patriot, which especially the ruler should have, but of course in a democracy the people is the ruler, so that means everyone should have it. The posture of a patriot means that you don't see the state as your property, your possession, as something for you to use and even to use up, something for you to loot, but rather you see yourself as part of the state and as serving the state. As the Prussian King Frederick the Great, whom Kant was a big fan of, said, I am the first servant of the state. Very much different from what King Louis XIV of France supposedly said. He probably didn't really say it, but supposedly he said, I am the state, right? That would be despotic, while the first statement would be patriotic. The patriot serves the whole, is even willing to sacrifice his self-interest and even himself, if need be, for the whole. But what's important here is that it really be the whole. And the only thing that truly is the whole is justice. Because justice is what represents the general will of the people. Not any particular will. Particular people can be driven by their self-interest, which may go against justice, and even every single particular will, if every person within the state is unjust, can go against justice. But still, the collective will, since everyone wants what is his secured, and can only get it secured if he also guarantees others that what is theirs is secured, the collective will is a will for justice. And justice is the only thing that rationally everyone could agree on. Everything else is the self-interest of a particular person, particular group, particular party, particular class, and therefore not everyone could voluntarily agree on it. People could be forced to serve it if that person or group or party or class happens to be the strongest, but not everyone could agree on it. And this is important for the definition of patriotism. Yes, You serve something higher than yourself. You even are willing to sacrifice yourself for that. But that must be the state and the state's justice as such. So you serve the rule of law, and you serve there being a just law, a just constitution. And this goes for the present, of course, but it also goes for the future, meaning as a patriot, you want to ensure that your state will remain as a just state, that there will remain a just constitution, and it will be passed on as such even when you yourself may die. Which of course would mean caring for the constitution, for the just rule of law as such directly. So making sure the state does not turn despotic, making sure it's not overtaken and the justice is not destroyed by unjust forces. But also, of course, it means the physical conditions for that, right? Like in our age, a true patriot would fight the climate crisis, would make sure to deal with the climate emergency, because the more that hits us, the more the state and the constitution and the rule of law, the justice is threatened, right? If we have big wildfires, or if we have droughts that don't allow us to grow food anymore, the rule of law and the constitution will probably break down. So, and this is important, what serving the whole and sacrificing yourself for the whole actually means. Because this means that you cannot confuse this patriotism with what people may nowadays think is patriotism, with nationalism. Because Kant says that serving your nation, so putting yourself into the side, or maybe even sacrificing yourself for your nation, when that nation does nothing for you, when it does not guarantee you your property from which you can live, when it does not guarantee you your freedom, but rather when it is unjust, to still serve it then is delusional. That's not patriotism. You are now chasing and serving a chimera. Here I want to stress, I have said it several times already, and I will get back to it when I talk about Kant's concept of aufklärung, as enlightenment, that aufkläring to him essentially means leaving delusions behind. And a delusion he defines as someone treating what should be only a means to an end, a means that serves a higher purpose, treating that as a purpose in itself. Right? So the greedy, the miserly person treats money not as a means to buy something, does not want to get wealthy so he can live in luxury, but rather treats money as a means to an end, tries to have money just to have money. That is delusional. And likewise, Kant would say that nationalism, like, does not use that word, that wasn't being used yet in that time, but he would say that serving your nation, sacrificing yourself for your nation when it is unjust, that is you being delusional. You are confusing a means with an end, because the nation or the state should be a means to achieve justice, to achieve the rule of law. It has no worth in itself, it only has worth as an instrument for justice. If you serve your state regardless of whether it is just or not, then you turn what should only be an instrument for another purpose into a purpose in itself, right? And I mean, we all know where this leads to. Like these delusional nationalists, they can be some despot can, for example, agitate them and manipulate them and use them in a war, right? Um, like let's take Putin and Moscow's war against Ukraine. Clearly, that doesn't serve. I mean, it's not just unjust against the Ukrainians, it also doesn't serve the people of Moscow. Maybe it serves Putin. Um, but the regular person, I mean, whose life has really improved because of that war? I mean, so many people, sons of that country, have died for what? And the country has suffered from sanctions. The country has had to focus its economy on the war, to produce for the war, for the military. I mean, how many millions and billions have been wasted for that war that could have been invested into improving that country? Improving the infrastructure, improving the social security, improving the education. So clearly, uh, the war does not serve the country, does not serve the justice, the freedom in Moscow. But through nationalism, of course, people can still be made to support it, even though it runs against their own self interest. But of course, also not only in war, right? A despot can also use that nationalism to stay in power, even when he is harming the country, because he plays into people's nationalism. I mean, just take Turkey. I happen to live in a part of Berlin with lots of Turkish people with Turkish roots living here. And Turkey under Erdogan, of course, is a despotic country. Um, Erdogan has taken people's freedom away, and he has done nothing but harm the country, right? I mean, Turkey's economy is in ruins. Um, the money has lost all its value. People are very poor, many people, and Turkey has not dealt with its issues properly. Like a time ago, there was this big earthquake that killed lots of people. Um, they didn't prepare for that. Like there was lots of corruption in the way buildings are built. That's why many buildings were not secure to withstand an earthquake. And also afterwards, even till now, many people were basically left alone that lost family or that lost their homes. The state did not care for them. And here too, I ask, whose life is really being improved by Erdogan's rule? How is Erdogan's rule really good for the country? Um, I mean, never mind what he's doing to others, um, like bombing the Kurdish people in Syria or in Iraq, but just focus on what he's doing to the Turks. Clearly, they would be better off with somebody else. Clearly, they would be better off with more justice. But then Erdogan pulled stunts like essentially forcing the world to start not using the English name Turkey anymore, even when talking about the country in English, but rather, even in English, using the Turkish name Turkey, right? So the UN has adopted that. So now the Turkish ambassador will have a sign in front of him not reading Turkey, but reading Turkey. Of course, that's completely ridiculous. Like, who cares? I mean, especially since the names are essentially the same, right? I mean, Turkey is just the English way to pronounce Turkey, basically. I mean, if we start with that, there are other countries which would have more grounds to complain because their name in the English language has nothing to do with the name they give themselves. Like my country, right? We call ourselves Deutschland, has nothing to do with Germany, yet you don't see us complaining and forcing the UN to give us a sign that reads Deutschland instead of Germany. Same with Japan or with Egypt or whatever, right? Who have completely different names in their own language, but still seem to be fine with being addressed with the English name. So this is just incredibly stupid. But there are many Turkish nationalists, and I know these guys. I have many living here. These young teenage boys who have absolutely nothing going on in their lives, who are pretty pathetic creatures. But then they will thump their chests and be like, "Oh, our leader Erdogan is so tough. Under him, Turkey is being respected. He made them use the name Turkey for us because he's so strong." And here too, I can ask them, does this improve a single person's life in Turkey? Like, is there a single person who now has a better life because a sign at the UN reads Turkey instead of Turkey? The answer is obviously no. But since they are not patriots, they might think they are, but they are not, because they don't care one bit about their country. They just care about this chimera in their head, about this image of their country. Since they are not patriots, they don't ask what's actually good for the country. And so a despot like Erdogan can tank the economy, can leave people alone after an earthquake, but then can pull something like that and will still find support. So it's important to not be delusional, to not just serve the country as such. The country as such has no worth, but rather true patriotism means serving justice, serving the law, and serving the country only insofar as it is an instrument of the law. So under despotism, a true patriot will not just serve, will not just say, well, I have to follow orders, well, I have to fight for my country, right or wrong, doesn't matter. But rather, here, a true patriot may even turn against his country. Of course, with the not truly against his country, only against the rulers of his country. Of course, with the intention of once again serving his country in a true sense, with the intention of getting rid of the despotism and establish the rule of law, establish justice. For that, yes, you may sacrifice yourself. But just for the nation as such, sacrificing yourself for that is completely irrational and delusional. So that is what true patriotism is. Serving justice. Serving the rule of law. And next, I want to talk about cosmopolitanism, which is not in opposition to this patriotism, but in a way is the other side of that, because if you truly want justice, if you truly want the rule of law, you cannot want it just for your country. I mean, what if your country is being attacked, and what if your country loses the war? Then the justice will probably be gone. But rather, you have to want to establish justice on the earth as a whole. You have to want for humankind as a whole to live in a just condition, and therefore a true patriot, whose patriotism is based on principles, Kant says, also has to be a world citizen, has to be cosmopolitan. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Leo Allmann, Cenk Kubilay Altu, Thomas Doringer, Gernot Klaufen, Benjamin Lening, Ökobong, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Spendierhosenträger, Ron Suhl, as well as to all others who support me and my aufkläring cause.